Chapter 10 of The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill McGilvery, Hingham, Massachusetts. The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constant Garnett. Chapter 10. Evil cannot be suppressed by the physical force of the government. The moral progress of humanity is brought about not only by individual recognition of the truth, but also through the establishment of a public opinion. Christianity destroys the state, but which is most necessary, Christianity or the state? There are some who assert the necessity of a state organization, and others who deny it, both arguing from same first principles. Neither contention can be proved by abstract argument. The question must be decided by the stage in the development of conscience of each man, which will either prevent or allow him to support a government organization. Recognition of the futility and immorality of supporting a state organization, contrary to Christian principles, will decide the question for every man, in spite of any action on the part of the state. Argument of those who defend the government, that it is a form of social life, needed to protect the good from the wicked, till all nations and all members of each nation have become Christians. The most wicked are always those in power. The whole history of humanity is the history of the forcible appropriation of power by the wicked and their oppression of the good. The recognition by government of the necessity of opposing evil by force is equivalent to suicide on their part. The abolition of state violence cannot increase the sum total of acts of violence. The suppression of the use of force is not only possible, but is even taking place before our eyes. But it will never be suppressed by the violence of government, but through men who have attained power by evidence recognizing its emptiness and becoming better and less capable of using force. Individual men, and also whole nations, pass through this process. By this means Christianity is diffused through consciousness of men, not only in spite of the use of violence by government, but even through its actions, and therefore the suppression is not to be dreaded, but is brought about by the national progress of life. Objection of those who defend state organizations that universal adoption of Christianity is hardly likely to be realized at any time. The general adoption of the truth of Christianity is being brought about not only by the gradual and inward means, that is, by knowledge of the truth, prophetic insight, and recognition of the emptiness of power, and renunciation of it by individuals, but also by another external means, the acceptance of a new truth by whole masses of men on a lower level of development, through simple confidence in their leaders. When a certain stage in the diffusion of a truth has been reached, a public opinion is created which impels a whole mass of men, formerly agnostic to the new truth, to accept it, and therefore all men may quickly be brought to renounce the use of violence when once a Christian public opinion is established. The conviction of force being necessary hinders the establishment of a Christian public opinion. The use of violence leads men to distrust the spiritual force, which is the only force by which they advance. Neither nation nor individuals have been really subjugated by force, but only by public opinion, which no force can resist. Savage nations and savage men can only be subdued by the diffusion of a Christian standard among them, while actually Christian nations, in order to subdue them, do all they can to destroy a Christian standard. These fruitless attempts to civilize savages cannot be adduced as proof that men cannot be subdued by Christianity. Violence by corrupting public opinion only hinders the social organization from being what it ought to be, and by the use of violence being suppressed, a Christian public opinion would be established. Whatever might be the result of the suppression of use of force, this unknown future could not be worse than the present condition, and so there is no need to dread it. To attain knowledge of the unknown and to move toward it is the essence of life. Christianity in its true sense puts an end to government. So it was understood at its very commencement. It was for that cause that Christ was crucified. So it has always been understood by people who were not under the necessity of justifying a Christian government. Only from the time that the heads of government assumed an external and nominal Christianity, men began to invent all the impossible, cunningly devised theories by means of which Christianity can be reconciled with government. But no honest and serious-minded man of our day can help seeing the incompatibility of true Christianity, the doctrine of meekness, forgiveness of injuries, and love, with government, with its pomp, acts of violence, execution, and wars. The profession of true Christianity not only excludes the possibility of recognizing government, but even destroys its very foundation. But if it is so, and we are right in saying that Christianity is incompatible with government, then the question naturally presents itself: which is more necessary to the good of humanity? In which way is men's happiness best to be secured? By maintaining the organization of government, or by destroying it and replacing it by Christianity? Some people maintain that government is more necessary for humanity, that the destruction of the state organizations would involve the destruction of all that humanity has gained, that the state has been and still is the only form in which humanity can develop. The evil which we see among people living under a government organization they attribute not to that type of society, but to its abuses, which they say can be corrected without destroying it, and thus humanity, without discarding the state organization, can develop and attain a high degree of happiness. And men of this way of thinking bring forward in support of their views arguments which they think irrefutable, drawn from history, philosophy, and even religion. But there are men who hold on the contrary that, as there was a time when humanity lived without government, such an organization is temporary, and that a time must come when men need a new organization, and that time has come now. And men of this way of thinking also bring forward in support of their views arguments which they think irrefutable from philosophy, history, and religion. Volumes may be written in defense of the former view, and volumes indeed have long ago been written, and more will still be written on that side. But much also can be written against it, and much also, and most brilliantly, has been written, though more recently, on this side. And it cannot be proved, as the champions of the state maintain, that the destruction of government involves a social chaos, mutual spoliation, and murder, the destruction of all social institutions, and the return of mankind to barbarianism. Nor can it be proved, as the opponents of government maintain, that men have already become so wise and good that they will not spoil or murder one another, but will prefer peaceful association to hostility, that of their own accord, unaided by the state, they will make all the arrangements that they need, and that therefore government, far from being any aid, under show of guarding men, exerts a pernicious and brutalizing influence over them. It is impossible to prove either of these contentions by abstract reasoning. Still less possible is it to prove them by experiment, since the whole matter turns on the question, ought we try the experiment? The question whether or not time has come to make an end of government would be unanswerable, except that there exists another living means of settling it beyond dispute. We may dispute upon the question whether the nestlings are ready to do without the mother hen and to come out of the eggs, or whether they are not yet advanced enough. But the young birds will decide the question without any regard for our arguments, when they find themselves cramped for space in the eggs. Then they will begin to try them with their beaks and come out of them of their own accord. It is the same with the question whether the time has come to do away with the governmental type of society and to replace it by a new type. If a man, through the growth of a higher conscience, can no longer comply with the demands of government, he finds himself cramped by it and at the same time no longer needs its protection. When this comes to pass, the question whether men are ready to discard the governmental type is solved, and the conclusion will be as final for them as for the young birds hatched out of the eggs. Just as no power in the world can put them back into the shells, so can no power in the world bring men again under the governmental type of society when once they have outgrown it. It may as well be that government was necessary and still necessary for all the advantages which you attribute to it, says the man who has mastered the Christian theory of life. I only know that on the one hand, government is no longer necessary for me, and on the other hand, I can no longer carry out the measures that are necessary to the existence of a government. Settle for yourself what you need for your life. I cannot prove the need or the harm of government in general. I know only what I need, and do not need what I can do and what I cannot. I know that I do not need to divide myself off from other nations, and therefore I cannot admit that I belong exclusively to any state or nation, or that I owe allegiance to any government. I know that I do not need all the government institutions organized within the state, and therefore I cannot deprive people who need my labor to give it in the form of taxes to institutions which I do not need, which for all I know may be pernicious. I know that I have no need of the administration or of courts of justice founded upon force, and therefore I can take no part in either. I know that I do not need to attack and slaughter other nations, or to defend myself from them with arms, and therefore I can take no part in wars or preparation for wars. It may well be that there are people who cannot help regarding all this as necessary and indispensable. I cannot dispute the question with them. I can only speak for myself, but I can say with absolute certainty that I do not need it, and that I cannot do it. And I do not need this and I cannot do it, not because such is my personal will, but because such is the will of Him who sent me into life, and gave me an indubitable law for my conduct through life. Whatever the arguments may be advanced in support of the contention that the suppression of government authority would be injurious and would lead to great calamities, men who have once outgrown the governmental form of society cannot go back to it again, and all the reasoning in the world cannot make the man who has outgrown the governmental form of society take part in actions disallowed by his conscience, any more than the full-grown bird can be made to return into the eggshell. But even it be so, says the champions of the existing order of things, still the suppression of government violence can only be possible and desirable when all men have become Christians. So long as among people nominally Christian there are unchristian wicked men, who for the gratification of their own lusts are ready to do harm to others, the suppression of government authority, far from being a blessing to others, would only increase their miseries. The suppression of the governmental type of society is not only undesirable so long as there is only a minority of true Christians, it would not even be desirable if the whole of a nation were Christian, but among and around them were still unchristian men of other nations. For these unchristian men would rob, outrage, and kill the Christians with impunity, and would make their lives miserable. All that would result would be that the bad would oppress and outrage the good with impunity, and therefore the authority of government must not be suppressed till all the wicked and rapacious people in the world are extinct. And since this will either never be, or at least cannot be for a long time to come, in spite of the efforts of individual Christians to be independent of government authority, it ought to be maintained in the interest of the majority. The champions of government assert that without it the wicked will oppress and outrage the good, and that the power of the government enables the good to resist the wicked. But in this assertion the champions of the existing order of things take for granted the proposition they want to prove. When they say that except for the government the bad would oppress the good, They take it for granted that the good are those who at the present time are in possession of power, and the bad are those who are in subjection to it. But this is just what wants proving. It would only be true if the custom of our society were what is, or rather is supposed to be, the custom in China, that is, that the good always rule, and that directly those at the head of government cease to be better than those they rule over, the citizens are bound to remove them. This is supposed to be the custom in China. In reality it is not so, and can never be so. For to remove the heads of government ruling by force, it is not the right alone, but the power to do so, that is needed. So that even in China this is only an imaginary custom. And in our Christian world we do not even suppose such a custom, and we have nothing on which to build up the supposition that it is the good or the superior who are in power. In reality it is those who have seized power and who keep it for their own and their retainers' benefit. The good cannot seize power nor retain it. To do this men must love power, and love of power is inconsistent with goodness, but quite consistent with the very opposite qualities: pride, cunning, cruelty. Without the aggrandizement of self and the abasement of others, without hypocrisies and deception, without prisons, fortresses, executions, and murders, no power can come into existence or be maintained. If the power of government is suppressed, the more wicked will oppress the less wicked, say the champions of state authority. But when the Egyptians conquered the Jews, the Romans conquered the Greeks, and the barbarians conquered the Romans, is it possible that all the conquerors were always better than those they conquered? And the same with the transition of power within a state from one personage to another. Has the power always passed from a worse person to a better one? When Louis XVI was removed and Robespierre came to power, and afterward Napoleon, who ruled then, a better man or a worse? And when were better men in power, when the Versailles party, or when the Commune was in power? When Charles I was ruler, or when Cromwell? And when Peter III was Tsar, or when he was killed, and Catherine was Tsarina in one half of Russia, and Pugachev ruled the other? Which was bad then, and which was good? All men who happen to be in authority assert that their authority is necessary to keep the bad from oppressing the good, assuming that they themselves are the good, par excellence, who protect other people from the bad. But ruling means using force, and using force means doing to him to whom force is used what he does not like, and what he who uses the force would certainly not like done to himself. Consequently, ruling means doing to others what we would not they should do unto us, that is, doing wrong. To submit means to prefer suffering to using force, and to prefer suffering to using force means to be good, or at least less wicked, than those who do unto others what they would not like themselves. And therefore, in all probability, not the better but the worse have always ruled and are ruling now. There may be bad men among those who are ruled, but it cannot be that those who are better have generally ruled those who are worse. It might be possible to suppose this with the inexact heathen definition of good, but with the clear Christian definition of good and evil, it is impossible to imagine it. If the more or less good and the more or less bad cannot be distinguished in the heathen world, the Christian conception of good and evil has so clearly defined the characteristics of good and the wicked that it is impossible to confound them. According to Christ's teachings, the good are those who are meek and long-suffering, do not resist evil by force, forgive injuries, and love their enemies. Those are wicked who exalt themselves, oppress, strive, and use force. Therefore, by Christ's teachings, there can be no doubt whether the good are to be found among rulers or ruled, and whether the wicked are among the ruled or the rulers. Indeed, it is absurd even to speak of Christians ruling. Non-Christians, that is, those who find the aim of their lives in earthly happiness, must always rule Christians, the aim of whose lives is the renunciation of such earthly happiness. This difference has always existed, and has become more and more defined as the Christian religion has been more widely diffused and more correctly understood. The more widely true Christianity has diffused, and the more it penetrates men's conscience, the more impossible it was for Christians to be rulers, and the easier it became for non-Christians to rule them. To get rid of governmental violence in a society in which all are not true Christians will only result in the wicked dominating the good and oppressing them with impunity, say the champions of the existing order of things. But it has never been and cannot be otherwise. So it has always been from the beginning of the world, and so it is still. The wicked will always dominate the good and will always oppress them. Cain overpowered Abel, the cunning Jacob oppressed the guileless Esau, and was in his turn deceived by Laban. Caiaphas and Pilate oppressed Christ. The Roman emperors oppressed Seneca, Epictetus, and the good Romans who lived in their time. John the Fourth with his favorites, the syphilitic drunken Peter with his buffoons, the vicious Catherine with her paramours, ruled and oppressed the industrious religious Russians of their times. William is ruling over the Germans, Stambulov over the Bulgarians, the Russian officials over the Russian people. The Germans have dominated the Italians. Now they dominate the Hungarians and Slavonians. The Turks have dominated and still dominate the Slavonians and Greeks. The English dominate the Hindus. The Mongolians dominate the Chinese. So that whether governmental violence is suppressed or not, the position of good men in being oppressed by the wicked will be unchanged. To terrify men with the prospects of the wicked dominating the good is impossible, for that is just what has always been, and is now, and cannot but be. The whole history of pagan times is nothing but a recital of the incidents and means by which the more wicked gained possession of power over the less wicked, and retained it by cruelties and deceptions, ruling over the good under the pretense of guarding the rights and protecting the good from the wicked. All the revolutions in history are only examples of the more wicked seizing power and oppressing the good, in declaring that if their authority did not exist, the more wicked would oppress the good. The ruling authorities only show their disinclination to let other oppressors come to power, who would like to snatch it from them. But in asserting this they only accuse themselves, say that their power, that is, violence, is needed to defend men from other possible oppressors in the present or the future. Footnote. I may quote in this connection the amazingly naive and comic declaration of the Russian authorities, the oppressors of other nationalities, the Poles, the Germans of the Baltic provinces, and the Jews. The Russian government has oppressed its subjects for centuries, and has never troubled itself about the Little Russians of Poland, or the Lets of the Baltic provinces, or the Russian peasants, exploited by everyone, and now it has all of a sudden become the champion of the oppressed, the very oppressed whom it is itself oppressing. End of footnote. The weakness of the use of violence lies in the fact that all the arguments brought forward by oppressors in their own defense can with even better reason be advanced against them. They plead the danger of violence, most often imagined in the future, but they are all the while continuing to practice actual violence themselves. You say that men used to pillage and murder in the past, and that you are afraid that they will pillage and murder one another if your power were no more. That may happen, or it may not happen. But the fact that you ruin thousands of men in prison, fortresses, galleys, and exile, break up millions of families, and ruin millions of men, physically as well as morally, in the army, that fact is not an imaginary but a real act of violence, which according to your own argument one ought to oppose by violence. And so you are yourselves these wicked men against whom, according to your own argument, it is absolutely necessary to use violence. The oppressed are sure to say to